This is part 2 of the Chapter 40 lecture notes. Okay, where we left off, we had talked about red blood cells or erythrocytes, and now we will, here we go. Now we will cover the white blood cells, known as leukocytes. There are 5 different types: neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils are white blood cells called granulocytes because they have, you can tell, they have little granules. You see the little granules inside the cells. And then monocytes and lymphocytes are agranulocytes. And a monocyte actually will develop into a macrophage. So sometimes they're called macrophages as well because that's what they become. White blood cells compose less than 1% of blood cells. The cells are actually larger than red blood cells, larger than erythrocytes, and they do have a nucleus. In fact, sometimes you can identify them because of their nucleus. If you look at the nucleus of a monocyte or macrophage, it's kidney-shaped and it's large, and a lymphocyte has a rounded nucleus that takes up almost the whole entire inside of the cell. So a lot of times the nucleus will help you identify the type of leukocyte. Again, the granular leukocytes are neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils, and then the agranular leukocytes are monocytes and lymphocytes. Basophils are responsible for releasing histamine, which is the chemical that causes your airways to constrict, your blood vessels to dilate whenever you have like an allergic reaction. That's why we take antihistamines to make us feel better. Eosinophils will increase when you have a parasitic infection, and neutrophils are the first responders to any infection. They're phagocytes, and they're the first responders to any infection. And the 3 that I'm circling are all phagocytes. Monocytes, neutrophils, and eosinophils are all phagocytes. That means that they engulf pathogens or abnormal cells and destroy them. Platelets, which the name for platelets is not up here, but just like red blood cells are erythrocytes and white blood cells are leukocytes, platelets are also known as thrombocytes. And they are not cells, whole cells, they are cell fragments that pinch off from larger cells in the bone marrow, and they function in blood clotting. And that is their only function. Blood vessels, we call them arteries, veins, and capillaries. And smaller arteries are arterioles. So blood leaves the heart through arteries. Arteries branch into arterioles. The arterioles take blood to the capillaries, and the capillaries supply our tissues with blood, which contains oxygen and nutrients. And then that blood drains back into venules, which lead to larger veins, and then the veins take the blood back to the heart. So that is actually the pathway of blood from the heart back to the heart. It's arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, veins. Differences in arteries and veins. The arteries have a very thick muscular layer called the tunica media. It's very thick. Whereas veins have a thin tunica media, and arteries have a smaller lumen. The lumen is the open space inside of the blood vessel. So the lumen of an artery is going to have a smaller diameter, and the lumen of a vein is going to have a larger diameter. And the reason is the arteries have muscular tunica medias, very thick muscular tunica medias, because arteries are under greater pressure than veins are. So the arteries and veins are composed of 4 tissue layers, even though there are differences in some of those tissue layers. Like I say, the tunica media is thicker in an artery than in a vein. But capillaries are only composed of a single layer of cells, single layer of endothelial cells, which are a type of epithelial cell. And that allows for diffusion, gas exchange, and the diffusion of nutrients and other metabolites between the blood and the body cells or tissue cells. The lymphatic system sort of goes along with the circulatory system because it is a system of vessels that contains a fluid. In the lymphatic system, a significant amount of water and solutes in the blood plasma filter through the capillaries to the tissue fluid, to the interstitial fluid. So that fluid that does not return to capillaries enters the lymphatic system and is called lymph. Lymph travels through lymphatic vessels and returns to the circulatory system through the subclavian vein. Now, the next page is a diagram showing the mammalian heart. So this would be like the human heart. And if we start with the right atrium, so blood enters the right atrium from the body systems. It flows into the right ventricle, bypassing or passing through a valve called the tricuspid valve. And then it leaves the right ventricle and travels to the lungs through the pulmonary trunk, which branches into the left and right pulmonary arteries. And then you have the blood goes to the lungs. And then it comes back to the heart through the pulmonary veins. It comes back to the left side of the heart from the lungs through the pulmonary veins. So now blood is in the left atrium. It travels through the mitral valve or bicuspid valve into the left ventricle. And then the aorta kind of goes up behind that pulmonary trunk. So the left ventricle pumps blood into the aorta, which takes that blood to the systemic circulation or the body systems. And then the blood comes back to the heart through the superior and the inferior vena cava, and they enter into the right atrium. And then the same pathway just goes over and over again. The septum or divider between the ventricles is called the interventricular septum. The outer layer of the heart is called the epicardium. The muscular layer is called the myocardium. And then the inner lining of the heart is the endocardium. The muscles that line the ventricles are called papillary muscles. Form little bumps, and the chordae tendineae that are attached to the tricuspid and mitral valves are hold those valves in place. They're like little tendons, and they hold those valves in place by attaching to the papillary muscles. And this is just another picture of the mammalian heart. So the heart has 2 pairs of valves. The first pair are called AV valves, which stands for atrioventricular. They keep the blood from flowing backward into the atria once it has entered the ventricles. The tricuspid valve is the valve on the right between the right atrium and the right ventricle, and then the bicuspid or mitral valve is on the left between the left atrium and the left ventricle. The other 2 valves are called semilunar valves because they look like half moons. And they ensure that blood that leaves the ventricles and enters either the pulmonary trunk or the aorta doesn't flow backwards back into the ventricles. So the pulmonary valve is located between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk, and the aortic valve is located between the left ventricle and the aorta. The pathway, the electrical signal that travels through the heart before the contraction of the heart itself The electrical signal starts with the SA node, the sinoatrial node here in the right atrium. That electrical signal spreads to the AV node, the atrioventricular node, and then to the bundle branches, which are located here, are the bundle of His first, and then the bundle branches here and here, and then the Purkinje fibers. It says the signal spreads through the ventricle walls, and these are called Purkinje fibers. And the cardiac signal, or the cardiac cycle, is divided between alternate stages of filling with blood, which is a relaxed state, and contraction. Relaxation is called diastole, and contraction is called systole. As the heart pumps blood, it makes sounds, and what we hear, the majority or the loudest sounds that we hear with a stethoscope are lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub. So the lub, the first heart sound, represents the AV valve slamming shut, and the dub represents the closing of the semilunar valve. It's a softer sound because they don't slam shut, as hard as the AV valves do. So the heart contains autorhythmic fibers, self-excitable autorhythmic fibers, and the most important is the SA node, or the sinoatrial node, which we also call the pacemaker of the heart. Now, the autonomic nervous system, in other words, the sympathetic and parasympathetic branches of the autonomic nervous system, can increase or decrease the heart rate. Sympathetic will increase the heart rate, and the parasympathetic will decrease the heart rate. This is an EKG electrocardiogram. The P wave represents, it says, depolarization of the atrium, which leads to contraction of the atrium. And then the QRS is contraction of the ventricle and relaxation of the atrium. And then the T wave is relaxation of the ventricle. So these are the three events that, the three peaks that cover the four events in the cardiac cycle. The big QRS peak is actually two things. It's contraction of the ventricle, and it kind of hides the relaxation of the atrium. Cardiovascular diseases are the leading cause of death in the United States. Atherosclerosis is a condition that's accumulation of fatty material within arteries that causes blood flow to slow down. It impedes blood flow. And arteriosclerosis is the hardening of the arteries due to calcium deposition. So there are two conditions that are found in people with cardiovascular disease. And this picture shows you an artery that has plaque buildup within it. So that's atherosclerosis, is what you're seeing in that picture. And then our last slide, when we measure blood pressure, we measure two numbers. We measure systole, which is when the ventricle is contracting, and diastole, which is when the ventricle is relaxing. We measure that blood pressure using the brachial artery, which is in your arm. And the highest pressure that we measure is the systolic pressure, and the lowest pressure is the diastolic. So, a normal blood pressure reading would be around 120 over 80, 120 for systolic, 80 for diastolic. Blood pressure will increase with blood volume, and blood volume is regulated by 4 hormones. Antidiuretic hormone causes you to retain fluid. Aldosterone does too, kind of indirectly by causing you to retain sodium, and therefore you're going to retain water because water follows salt. And so both of these, ADH and aldosterone, are going to increase the blood pressure. Atrial natriuretic hormone released by the heart itself is going to decrease blood pressure, and nitric oxide is going to, the vasodilator,